Blood Sabbath is the debut full-length from uh, Montreal, Quebec-based death metal band Serpent Corpse. We could qualify the obvious death metal tag with an old school traditional style, which is also heavily influenced by metal punk, and I mean crossover thrash metal in general, but not the typical kind of death thrash metal style that would imply. This band generally comes from folks you might know. I think most people who are interested in underground old school death metal of today would recognize Disembodiment for their EP, and that guitarist is also in this band. But this is something different, and it has been since their demo tape. Their demo was more of a an off kilter crossover or just crust punk influenced death metal record, which had a distinct style, but sort of an undecided. It wasn't necessarily decided upon. It wasn't fully fleshed out. It was definitely an experiment, which they'd sort of hammered out in the meantime. So we'll get to a clip just to sort of get an idea of where this pretty varietal record touches down and finds its identity. So if you're familiar with 90s hardcore, and less, I mean hardcore punk, and I definitely mean the sort of pre-Hatebreed breaking kind of thing and metalcore in general, just if you understand what those rhythms are and how they developed out of late 80s hardcore, you'll sort of understand where a lot of the rhythms and such come into play with this band. And I think that's a kind of a subtle thing. It was also a subtle thing in bands like Mammoth Grinder, and I think that's part of the sound here. It's part of the appeal here, and it does work pretty well with the sort of early 90s death metal style that's played here, which we could liken to early Obituary in some sense, but this is a different style of pacing, and it certainly lines up with these sort of crust punk influenced death metal of the last 20 years in some respects. Now these are all nuances, and this is very much a death metal record, but there's such a strong sort of Celtic Frost era like riffcraft touch to this thing, and there's a couple of death doom metal songs on here that break up the conversation into a more dynamic death metal record. And I think that's kind of the appeal of this thing, is that you could probably enjoy this if you're even just a fan of like what Power Trip has added to metal in the last several years. But there's also songs in here that I think a Dream Death fan would appreciate for their sway and movement and riffcraft. And I think there's a sound here where if you're just a fan of like Slowly Rewrought or even Cause of Death, there's things that you like that'll be on this record that are pretty recognizable right away. So, a big part of the appeal of this record is just kind of the render. The production values are very sharp. I think their demo was produced by Arthur Rizek, and this is done by different fellows who have really done a great job of not making this sound like every other death metal record out there. It's a very clean render, but still a band that they have like a very organic register that really works here for me. Otherwise, I think the vocalist has a very kind of good midway point between something very hardcore-ish and clear, a very strong diction in the vocals, and it makes it so that a lot of these stand out, not only for their riffs and their rhythms and the mechanics of death metal, but also for the vocals and what they add to it. And I think it's an interesting touch, which we don't get a lot today. There's a lot of personality from this band right away, and it comes through with their songwriting, which is rare enough and kind of warrants this being one of the more exciting and interesting death metal records of the early July period. So for me, this was a high recommendation, and probably one of the better records of July, I think, overall, looking ahead. And if you're a fan of everything from like Realms of Chaos to early Obituary, you'll get this right away. But I think this is one where I think if you are a big fan of like the history of metal punk and how that relates to death metal, and there's a lot of cool extra crossover to discover here for a band that's sort of on point with what's popular right now, but not trying to sound like anything that is popular right now. So pretty interesting if you're a fan of just metal punk and how that crosses over into death metal too. But also just a great death metal record again. So check it out. It released a couple of days ago, and read the review if you feel like learning more.